It's an absolute pleasure, Andre, to spend some time with you. We had actually planned to do it together, but then Biden decided to visit Geneva at this very moment, and there's security everywhere. So unfortunately, we couldn't be in the same place, or in Athens for that matter. I really enjoyed your presentation. Let's just have a chat about that, and let's just kick this off. I'm actually curious, right? You've told me the last time we met to prepare this that you've been looking at the airline industry for a while to see how we've done this, and I'm going to turn this back to you. You're obviously very busy implementing some new standards. You're working with DSCA. You're working in EBL. How's it going? How is this progressing? What's your experience so far?
Yeah, that's a good question, Henk, and hi everyone, and thanks for having us remotely, by the way. In case you don't know, it is 29 degrees in Geneva today and sunny, so it feels like we're in Athens, even if we're just kilometers away. No, I was actually looking at one of your slides with a timeline, of how you exchange information from let's say the 80s or before with the paper-based, and then 2000 with EDI. 2020 with APIs, and that's similar to what we've done in the maritime industry. The difference is that between 2000, when we started to look at creating some standards with Intra, for example, and 2019 when we created DSCA, we had very few standards to allow us or other software companies to build solutions. And we also limited the scope to very basic messages, like bookings, shipping instructions, invoices, and a couple of other things. So, yes, I've always looked at the airline industry for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I love airplanes. I love flying. I was a pilot for many years. But also because, I thought to myself, it's interesting how an organization could get so many airlines together. And of course, in the maritime, if you look at the main container carriers, there's much less of us. So how did they manage to get everybody together, create standards, and then of course get them adopted? Because that's the biggest challenge. And yeah, I think in our case it was a decision from two lines. Actually, we got together and we said, that there's got to be a solution to exchanging information between ourselves. So that was the first, motivator. And then, of course, we looked at, the bigger picture, e-commerce, upcoming digital platforms, ecosystems, and that comes afterwards. What else can I say? Very challenging, very, very challenging for many reasons, some of which you stated very clearly. I love your slide, which, shows, I think it was in number 11, where you look at all the difficulties and how you manage to convince people to adopt. So once again, I'm going to copy the aviation industry.
Well, by all means, and actually, I really enjoy working together with different industries, and I'm very glad I've met you. And actually, I'm even happy that we're in the same city, which will make this easier. You said something there about how did we do this, and there's some things that you cannot copy, unfortunately. Partly the reason why some of these things have worked at IATA is that we're a very, very old organization. We were first founded back in 1929 when there were only a few airplanes in the sky, and the idea of an airline had only just been invented. And you could just imagine that in those days, an airline like Air France or Swiss Air or anyone would only have had 2 or 3 airplanes, small ones, right, where you put a few people in. And it's very easy to see how they would get together and with brandy and cigars and said, oh, hey, let's agree on how we do business. And if you fast forward that spirit has never left the organization. And even though right now we have 400 members, there is still a tremendous camaraderie among airlines, knowing that they're doing this together. And so when IATA decides IATA is the airlines. When the airlines decide they want to do something like develop a new standard, they start off with the mindset that they're going to agree. And then once they have agreed, they will implement it, to the point where some of our decisions as an association, they're mandatory. When we decide certain things, every single airline has to implement it, or they'll be asked to leave the organization. So there are certain types of decisions that are mutually agreed and enforced. But unfortunately, digitalization is not one of those. We cannot enforce digitalization. If we could, we would have finished the job 20 years ago. So I think that I didn't put that one on the list of all these things that we have done. But I think that in some way, the fact that you have fewer container shippers actually doesn't help. When you have many more people, it's almost a democracy, right? You can almost manage it like that. Fewer members is harder. So in that sense, I'm actually really interested to see what strategies you're going to come up with as an industry. And I'd love to sit on the sideline and provide my comments in that sense. But yeah, it's really exciting to see this happening, Andre.
Well, yeah, I mean, Henk, first of all, thanks for everything you're doing. I think...
Keep talking. You're just going to prime view of... sorry.
No? There we are, finally.
That's
so he won't be late for dinner. That's really good news.
No, that's good. And I believe that his helicopter is ready to take him to the hotel. So my apologies to the conference, but I'm an airline geek. I can't help it.
No, I think, indeed you had the time and you had the size. This is something I understand. I think, as you say, it's not easier because we're less. But on the other hand, I think that camaraderie, we've had it at a technical level, maybe differently from the commercial, the regular normal competition. But, I think what we've managed to agree upon between us is that technology is not going to be the differentiator. So I think that's already a positive thing forward. In the old days, perhaps one of the carriers would have an idea of, a new app or a new solution based on some new tech. And then what would happen is they would probably invest heavily in the R&D, and then 6 months later, everybody would copy them. And that, in the end, is not efficient. And also the fact that, as you mentioned, we have a lot of customers in common between the carriers. So, but I think one of the main, I don't know if it's a main difference, but I think we have a lot of third parties involved. And of course, in the aviation, you have mainly the airports. And then, of course, from a cargo perspective, you have the continuation of the cargo. But we have so many third parties. We also have the regulators, as you do in aviation, but they haven't had all that time to look at, standards and digitalization and efficiencies. So the work today that we do as a carrier, but also, of course, as DCSA with its very small footprint for the moment, is to talk to the regulators, to talk to the customs authorities, to talk to various government entities, to talk to, of course, customers, vendors, ports, terminals. There's so many that we need to convince. And then, of course, you have the old story of, legacy, what we call legacy systems, which often I call production systems, but, legacy systems. So how do you make all those changes, and what changes do you make and when do you make them? And I think that's an important aspect where probably many companies sort of think, well, let's wait until all that is ready before we actually dive in. And that's probably one of the things that slows us down.
I think you're right, and in that sense, standards are no different from products. You see this when a new technology comes along. There's the early innovators and there's the laggards, and most people are somewhere in between, And I think in many cases, our standards, we're sort of in the very early stages, and therefore, yes, there are companies that will adopt it and implement it and be very happy with it, but the bulk of it is waiting. I think you said something interesting just now, is that we have a common customer, which we do, the forwarder and ultimately the shipper. And it's partly why I'm really enjoying this conversation, because we've always known that a lot of the answers that we seek, a lot of the problems we need to solve actually relate to the shipper. And ultimately, we don't have a direct relationship because the forwarder is acting on our behalf or acting in between or on behalf of the shipper. But what I do know is that the sort of problems that we have tried to solve on the air freight industry with the forwarders as our partners, in many cases they've risen to the challenge, and in many cases they are supporting. I think I showed you, I may have showed you, but the airway bill adoption is now 75%. It's going very fast now. It'll be at 100 by the end of next year. Well, that's forwarders doing that. You know, it's not just the airlines, it's mostly forwarders. So what I'm actually hopeful of is that even though I realize that many forwarders are organized in silos, right? If a shipper talks to forwarder, there's the maritime division and the aviation division and the road division and the rail division, and in some cases inland waterways. But I would have thought that, let's say, just for the sake of a mind experiment, you and I go and visit a forwarder and say, we'd like to talk about digitalization. I think at the entrance, they will split us and say, you go left, you go right. And we say, no, we don't do that. We're together here. I think the fact that you could do that would actually change the conversation. And then maybe, crazy as it sounds, get the maritime forwarder to talk to the aviation forwarder and say, can we maybe use the same approach? How did you deal with your business processes in our corporate environment? Because one thing is for sure, every company inside has digitized. You know, there's no issue about that. They all have these management systems. They all do. It's just what comes out is not the same. So I think the time we've taken, it won't be so long. It won't, definitely not, because there's that advantage. And so I think that is one of my suggestions, is that work with the forwarders and make sure that they learn from their own innovations they have already done on the aviation side.
Yeah, of course. And that's what we chatted about the other day. And you're absolutely right. I think, and of course we are doing that, but we're still at a point where we don't actually have standards in some cases. So, you know, DCSA has been coming up, came out in December with a standard for the bill of lading with the data elements, but then you have the technology. And, you know, if you don't have the right technology, then you have a problem on the legal front. In terms of, you know, the protection insurance clubs need to sort of to approve the technology solutions. So very funnily, this morning I had a discussion where I brought together two vendors of, you know, EBL solutions, and it was very funny because the two CEOs, obviously coming from the tech side, were sort of, you could see that they were holding back. You know, I'm not going to share my tech, and I'm not going to share, but we have to find a way to be interoperable. And I said to them, you know, guys, I've introduced you. Now you go and have a session and talk about how you're going to create that interoperability. Because if you don't, then you're going to be stuck with customers using one solution and, you know, maybe buyers or receivers using another solution. So I think that's part of the discussion we have today. As I mentioned in the presentation, we launched a solution where we're using a third-party vendor working with us, and that's picking up. Now, the question is, how are we going to deal with all the other customers that might be using or piloting different solutions? And my answer to that is, well, we have to work very, very hard on making that interoperable. We don't develop, we don't develop software solutions as DCSA, for example, and obviously as MSC we're limited. So I think that's the stage we're at now. If we can, you know, cross that barrier, then I think we'll be in a much better position to roll it out, and hopefully it'll happen very quickly and then be followed by all the rest. Because, you know, don't forget we have, as you did, a whole bunch of documents that they're still moving around the world by airplane. So I guess in a way it's good.
It's good for us, yeah. Well, the scenario you described is a good one. We have exactly the same dynamics, Andre. When I create a new working group to start working on a new standard, we always invite the IT solution providers in the room as well. They participate. And very often they're the ones doing all the talking because they have the expertise around technology. And that's fine. I'm happy for them to lead. In any case, their stakeholders, the airlines, forwarders, are in the room as well. So they've already make sure they're going in the right direction. But what's interesting is that when it comes to implementations and products, just like you said, they won't talk to each other. In fact, they won't even talk to me because they realize that although I'm a neutral party, I know far too many customers. So they won't share what they do with me. So what you get is that you see this room and there's a solution provider whispering to a customer on one side and another one whispering on the other side. But what makes it work is the fact that I, as IATA, am in the room. I'm creating the platform for them. And so that they realize sooner or later, whatever they do, they're going to have to comply with the very standard that they have jointly developed. Very often they won't push it because they have legacy products as well. They don't want to kill the legacy products by coming up with something new. So we have to put pressure on them. And so it is really a communication that has to come from all sides to all parties. And the more that gets out there, the more you can repeat that story about the relevance of these standards like EBL, the more it will move. There's no other way. So yeah, you're obviously on the right track. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting here. But it sounds really exciting, actually, to be honest, what you're doing.
No, it is, and as I mentioned, I think if you look at the volume of information that we exchange between all the parties in a very simple transaction, whether they're BCOs or forwarders or what have you, it's really huge. And we do need to find a way to simplify that, to make it more efficient. But as I mentioned, you need to get all the other parties on board. And I didn't mention, of course, banks, insurance companies. We spoke to a lot of banks during the pandemic because, of course, they had problems getting the documents for their customers with letters of credit. And there was a very open discussion. But as soon as things got better, that discussion changed. And so I think that sort of helped us to move it, one step forward. And now we have to continue. We have to, as you mentioned, we have to keep on promoting it. We have to find probably better ways to do it as a team. And yeah, I can only, hope that things are going to change before we both retire. Or we swap seats. And then
that reminds me, Andre, I have a question for you, or maybe a suggestion, which is that when I look at my kids, right, that have grown up, they were more or less born, I think both of them are genuinely digital natives, right? They were born with cell phones in their hands almost. Not quite, because, I'm a tough dad. I wouldn't let them have these things when they were very young, but obviously they grew up with this and their whole life is on it. My son doesn't understand email. He thinks it's a strange concept because they don't work like that. So here's the question. So my son is graduating, as my daughter already has. In 10 years from now, they'll be managers. And if they're smart, they'll be leading companies. I don't think that's the case, but for different reasons. But their generation will become our bosses, whether or not we retire, Andre. Some people that are maybe not quite there yet, they'll be reporting to digital natives very soon. And somehow, I can't imagine a scenario where these people are leading our companies, and whether they are leading container shipping organizations, associations, companies, or airlines, or forwarders, or even customs and government, that they will accept that there's paper, there's people in warehouses with clipboards, with pencils, ticking boxes, and believe me, I've seen it not long ago. I can't accept that they will get some IT innovation project where somebody presents them with COBOL code that was written in 1970. I see that on my desk today, not 20 years ago. So how do you think that generation is going to either disrupt, or do you think we'll be capable of getting ready for them so that we hand them something that is digitalized and that they can just run with and make a success of? I'm curious what your views are on that.
Well, look, I think you absolutely nailed it, Henk, because that is the solution. I also have a daughter. She's 26. And I think I bought her first computer when she was 5. It was one of these very colorful iMacs. So she grew up with that, and she grew up with the internet. And of course, if today I have a conversation with her about what we're talking now, she thinks I'm completely, crazy. So I think that the younger generation, I'm not giving them any names, but they're basically becoming, very soon they'll be the majority of the workforce. Mm-hmm. And I think that is probably what we need to look at when we have these conversations. It's not so much about, should we be doing this or should we not be doing this? And in the case of MSC, digitization is at the top of the agenda, but you can't do it alone. And this is the part that I think we can benefit from that. I'm absolutely convinced. They will not accept to continue working in this way, or they won't be working in shipping. And then it becomes a problem for us.
Yeah, that won't happen. They'll be there. Kathy.
Hi, gentlemen. I don't like to interrupt because this is fascinating, but we do have some questions from the floor for you that I'd like to put to you. But first of all, one that I want to ask, that actually someone on here has asked as well, is Andre, MSC running its IT off a classic Mac in the background?
Yes, absolutely. And I was going to switch it on, but unfortunately, it doesn't want to boot today, so I didn't switch it on.
Oh, what a shame! So it's not your day-to-day computer then.
Unfortunately, not. No, not part of the standards.
Right. So a few questions. Let's start from the top here. So a question from the floor in Athens. An industry joint call to action. How would you feel about that? For example, to develop technical standards coordinated by ISO TC8?
Well, yes, thank you for the suggestion. That's what we're trying to do at DCSA with our meager resources. But yes, absolutely. There's a lot of conversations taking place between the different organizations and associations to really try to get there. To be very honest, we had a lot of plans. Unfortunately, the plans we had in the past year didn't materialize because we couldn't all get together. So watch this space, as they say, or our respective social media platforms, because things are going to happen. Yes, absolutely.
Great. I will just throw into the mix that's the sort of thing we are looking at as well across Smart Maritime Network. So sorry, I had to do our own little plug there too.
I'll say it twice just before we finish.
Thank you. Right. So a question, this has come from one of our virtual audience, Murat Koksel. Question for DCSA. How can the maritime industry prevent undeclared and misdeclared cargo to prevent and minimize container ship fires?
Very good question. It's a topic we didn't touch upon today, but I think there's various things. First of all, better sharing of information, which allows risk management solutions to work in the background. Secondly, smart containers. I think that's part of the solution of the future. Containers that can report, apart from the positioning, but also changes in temperature, changes in emission of specific gases and things like that. So that's definitely something that we're actually working on very heavily, even if the market doesn't seem to be ready for these solutions. But I think these are two elements that could really help in the future.
And Henk, a similar question for you for IATA. What measures do you have in place to prevent undeclared and misdeclared dangerous goods being transported?
It's an interesting question because this is the #1 problem we have. Of all the problems we have, that's the one that the airline CEOs get most excited about in our meetings is undeclared, in our case, undeclared lithium batteries. Most of the time, the reason they're not declared is because they're below standards, and they're exactly the ones that cause fires. And if we don't know that they're, we've tried many things. We've tried awareness campaigns with shippers. We've tried awareness campaigns with governments. And slowly but surely, we're changing our tone as an organization and saying, yeah, you need to do all of that. You need to have awareness. But you know what? Put these people in jail. The people that do not declare and are causing fires, and whether it's, in our case, in aircraft, which can, of course, can be disastrous. In many cases, it happens on the ground, so there's just cost involved. But put these people in jail. Send a warning that this is not acceptable. You cannot put everybody at risk. So sort of that's where we're heading, as tough as that. Now, obviously, that requires a little lobbying, but we have a very tough CEO at the moment that like to say things like that. So I think we'll see that happen. We'll actually see people in jail for misdeclaring or undeclaring goods.
Interesting. So another question from the floor here in Athens. Are carrier-specific associations neutral enough to support end-to-end supply chain collaboration and standardization? It's really for both of you, but who wants to start?
I'm happy to start, Andre.
Please.
I've looked at the number of industry associations, and so I have some idea of how they perform and whether they perform at all. From experience, IATA is very deliberately extremely neutral. And whenever we work with solution providers, we either go out to the whole world and say, we're looking for a solution, everybody can work with this, or better still, we work with multiple solution providers to make sure there's some competition in the market, which is the only way we keep our credibility, because if we start associating ourselves with a particular solution provider, we lose our credibility in being independent. I have seen an industry association, and I won't name it, that has decided that in order to fund their operations, they need to do a partnership with a major digital solution provider. Well, guess what? All of the competition to that solution provider turned away from that industry association. Not only have they lost their credibility, they have lost their reach. So I think it's absolutely critical. You cannot make mistakes with that. You must remain neutral. At least that's my view on this.
Yeah, whatever Henk said. I mean, when we created the association, again, it's only 2 years ago. We had to keep it to a very small group of people so that we could take decisions. If we had opened up immediately, and ended up with 100 members, it would have taken us much more time to release the standards we've already released. But of course, part of the work we need to do, and we have a board meeting very shortly, is to start including now other associations and vendors. Vendors we included in some of the discussions on IoT, for example, but we're definitely being open to that now that we have an organization that is properly structured.
Do you find, Andre, that your members are open to that, to you bringing in the technology providers, the solution providers, and having these open dialogues?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, look, I think we don't have a choice, because it's the only way, and part of what Henk was saying in his intro, it's the only way to promote adoption. Otherwise, it's just, you use the standard if you want to use it. And by the way, everything we publish is of course free. We don't have any licensing deals for the moment. This is all free of charge. So I think, but again, getting adoption, it's you're always chasing your tail with the adoption story.
Yeah. And a question for both of you. You've touched on forwarders already in your chat, but a question actually from one of our virtual audience as well is, how are forwarders involved in both IATA and DCSA efforts?
Well, I mean, as far as DCSA is concerned, they are involved as, you mean as a group, for example. So as a group,
I think so, yeah, more generally, how you're involving them in the ongoing plans.
Sure.
And discussions.
So we talk to quite a lot of customers, more of the larger companies, particularly importers in the US with very large volumes who have a lot of problems to solve. But we also talk to the forwarder associations. And there's a couple of them. So that's done very openly, absolutely. Like I said, we can't do anything alone, because this is not it's a carrier initiative, but the goal is to be first completely neutral. We don't talk about solutions. We allow vendors to do whatever they wish, and hopefully one day we can put a stamp of approval. But that's probably where it stops for the moment.
From my side, if I go back a few decades or even before, the forwarders were actually considered to be agents of airlines. They were actually the sales network for airlines, and in those days, airlines were paying fixed commissions. Okay, so it was a good model. Then the airlines decided to take away the commission, and that changed the whole dynamics. Initially, there was a lot of bad blood because the forwarders felt they had been abandoned. We're past all of that now, but the role of the forwarder has changed significantly. They really are, in a way, they're now the most important party in the supply chain, because they're the ones coordinating everything. And so when we are doing developments, we always make every effort we can to involve them, but it doesn't always work. Certainly we work with the associations, for example, IATA, Whenever we do anything, they're on our mailing list, and we invite them to our meetings, we invite them to participate, but they don't always have the time and the resources to do so. And we reach out to individual companies, some of which are very interested in working with us. And actually, some of them contacted me, say that they were looking forward to this chat because they thought it was amazing that aviation and aviation and maritime would actually talk together, which is something that's news to them. But these were the forwarders telling me that. And so it's we would love to see more of them, actually, for the simple reason that you cannot come up with digital solutions from one side only. You need to talk to someone digitally, and therefore, before you do it digitally, you need to use your voice to do so. And so we try very hard, but it's not always easy. On top of that, forwarders have their own agenda as well. You know, they're private companies. They may or may not decide they like the idea of standards. The biggest forwarders would love to become even bigger without necessarily making it easy for their smaller competitors. So it's commercial dynamics, really, I think, will be the answer to that.